it's interesting, isn't it? That I mean, the rollout of the flu vaccination. I don't know when that first happened on the kind of annual scale that we have it, but it's in people's diaries now. Come the winter, flu jab's coming out, no problem, no real controversy, and yet we don't see that quite the same relaxed response to the COVID jab.
That's correct. But if you look at the vaccination rates, it's actually pretty similar, right? I read the statistics today. It's about 80%, I think, of people over 60 or 65 have received the flu jab, which is the highest ever, which is great. But over 90% of over 65s have received the COVID jab. So there is definitely controversy, that's for sure. And the controversy over the COVID vaccine, at least in our perception, is a lot stronger. There seem to be a lot more conspiracy theories making the rounds and so on than for the flu jab.
Yeah.
But that might also simply be a function of the fact that the COVID vaccine is for everyone and it's global. And that means that if you read on social media, for example, about an adverse event of someone having, stroke maybe from the COVID vaccine, which is extremely rare, but theoretically possible in, let's say, Argentina, you'll hear about it here, right? Or it's possible that you hear about it here, especially if you're in the kind of social media environment, perhaps, where those kinds of stories get shared. You're more likely to be exposed to it. Whereas with the flu vaccine, there simply is no similar discussion going on, and therefore people hear about it less.
Yeah, and it's perhaps we just understand it more. And of course, in the absence of explanation, that's often, as you know, in your world, where conspiracy theories begin. And the government possibly not even covering itself in glory, maybe in the way that information is given out. And again, when information is missing, people fill in the gaps.
That is definitely a factor. It's called a need for cognition within psychology. So basically a need to, as you say, fill in the gaps, acquire fitting explanations for certain phenomena. And people who score higher in scales that measure that tend to also, in the absence of certainty about certain topics, for example, about vaccines, to need to find explanations that are, let's say, alternatives to official explanations.
What have you made then of the fairly, a minority of people, it should always be acknowledged, but nonetheless, a very significant, loud set of voices who believe certainly that the COVID vaccination is, it comes with some fairly dark secrets attached to it, and that the thinking behind it is nefarious. It's got New World Order all over it, the Great Reset, you name it, it's all connected to it. This might be a vaccination for COVID, but the next one you get in your annual booster will have a tracking device in it, it'll change your DNA. There's 1,000 different explanations that people have as to what the COVID jab will do. What do you make of that as a psychologist, Jon? What's your reading on this?
Well, one important thing to note is that conspiracy theories about vaccinations are really old. They're basically as old as vaccinations are. So they've always been around, right? Much like conspiracy theories are really old. They were around in the Roman Empire, for example, about certain emperors. They've always sort of existed. But the COVID vaccine and the COVID crisis, of course, provides an ideal environment for these kinds of conspiracy theories to become popular, right? It's a global problem. We're all connected internationally. A lot of people communicate with each other online. For example, a lot of people speak English, even in countries that don't speak it as their official language. And every country in the world suffers from COVID somehow.
Yeah.
So that means that events that take place in one country can easily transfer to other countries and be discussed there as being very important. And that means that is a very fertile breeding ground, if you want to call it that, for these kinds of conspiracy theories to become popular. And then what also doesn't help, of course, is that conspiracy theorists, people who are inclined to not believe official narratives, can, of course, point to certain things that are maybe not necessarily true, but certainly plausible, right? Not every instance of communication by governments, let's say, across the duration of the crisis, has been equally reliable. It's changed over time and so on. So if you want to spread conspiracy theories, one of the ways to do that is by pointing at sort of plausible instances of, you might want to call it manipulation or deception or whatever it might be, by official entities, and then say, see, they're lying to us. They're not always telling the truth. So why should we believe them now?
And it's quite powerful, isn't it, when you see, I don't know, an image of the Australian police using rubber bullets or smashing somebody's door down because they've made a Facebook post, the kind of stuff that you would only ever get in a sort of episode of Black Mirror or something. You can see why unprecedented state response to something, whatever the reason, it does feed almost effortlessly into the wider debate, which includes vaccinations.
Yes, that's right. And what I also think is really important to emphasize is the role of emotion here. So emotional images and emotional videos, but also emotional statements. For example, if you talk about, let's say, an innocent child that falls ill after being vaccinated against COVID, right? That evokes certain emotions in us that have the power to override, for example, statistical thinking, right? Like if a child falls ill from the COVID vaccine, that is really horrible, of course. If the likelihood of that happening is 1 in 500 million, let's say, right? We might not interpret that the same way if it's a real child that we can really see and we can read a story about this kid and so on and so on, right? So that matters a lot in terms of influencing our perceptions. And it's the same thing with the example you mentioned of the police beating down the door of someone who posted something on Facebook. It's an evocative image that we interpret differently than cold hard stats.
Sure. I think there was I was reading quite recently, I think there were anti-vaccination protests in Leicester in the 1800s or something. I can't remember what the vaccination was for, but something like 80,000 people took to the streets, and that was 100 years ago.
Yeah. As I said, it's a really old thing. Yeah. Also because it's, a needle that people sometimes don't like. It's a substance that goes into your body, right? Even though you don't feel ill. So it's easy to tell stories about this that rely on emotion and evoking emotion somehow.
Yeah, so doesn't it? It's the image of the syringe, which has sort of been a metaphor for all manner of thrillers and films about this kind of stuff. I suppose it's all perfect, isn't it? All sits nicely into place.
It can be used for such purposes if you're so inclined, which also makes it really tough to tackle, of course.
Jon, thank you. Great to have you on, sir. Jon Roozenbeek, who's a research fellow at the Department of Psychology, University of Cambridge, where he works on online misinformation, vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy theories.